early takes, or they never. But I remember reading an interview with someone. They go, "Yeah, De Niro. He likes to, ease and warm up into it."
Usually I think with De Niro, a lot of it is how you make yourself look. You get the squinty eyes and the sideways.
He does that. Dude, have you seen the trailer for Churchill?
No, I have not.
You know who's playing him?
Robert De Niro?
Gary Oldman.
Really? Well, Gary Oldman he's got range.
And they said he spent a total of 200 hours in the makeup chair.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, not per day.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, because obviously you have to make him up heavily, but he's just such a good actor.
Yeah.
He could play Oprah, I'm telling you.
Yeah, he probably could play Oprah. So you ready to do this? Ready to jump into
Yeah.
this? So we are live from the Pantheon of Pedagogy, the Mecca of Methodology, your vacation from vacation, the educational cave where you can learn to seriously take teaching not so seriously. This is, and we are,
Classroom Hacks.
One day we'll get on. We'll be in sync with that.
Yeah, we didn't even rehearse.
No, we definitely did not.
In fact, we didn't even plan that we were going to say it at the same time.
Yeah, we just kind of looked. I know you can't see this out there in podcast world, but we just kind of looked at each other, got lost in each other's eyes.
Got lost in each other's eyes, like the old Debbie Gibson song. Boy, I'm dating myself with that comment.
Don't reference Debbie Gibson, even though we all love
You don't even know who she is.
You don't even know.
You're a youngster. You're a youngster. I'm the old man here.
As we said, we are live from the Mecca of Methodology, and this is Classroom Hacks. I'm Eric Tan, and my partner here. Would you say we are now officially the Batman and Robin of this podcasting thing?
Okay, so you've made me Robin by default?
Well, no.
We never even discussed this.
You made yourself Robin by default.
Yeah, but you're the one that introduced the Batman Robin concept. So I'm going to assume that you're not going to make yourself the second guy.
All right. What about the Siegfried and Roy of this? Aren't they pretty much equal in that they were both mauled viciously by a tiger?
You've made me Roy, so I'm the second one in the. I can't win here. I want to talk to my agent.
All right. we were represented by the same guy.
Well, that's a good point. All right.
So
just buy me a cup of coffee and we're even.
I owe you that much.
Okay.
Housekeeping. I don't know. What do you call it in class? Do you call it housekeeping? Notes of. How do you go back and say this is what, in case you missed it previously on,
Yeah, something from the previous class.
Yeah.
Sometimes housekeeping. Sometimes I say, okay, we have to cross some T's and dot some I's from last class. Is housekeeping what you typically call it?
Yeah, usually housekeeping if it's something that I'm bringing up from a previous class, and then dates of note if it's something that I need them to know for a future class.
Nice, very nice. Now, how do you make a decision? What's the key, or what are some, I guess for lack of a better word, criteria that you have to say this is worth bringing up for the next class? Mm-hmm. Like I missed this, we didn't do this, or I never got to this. So, as opposed to when do you just let it go and say, okay, move on, not worth bringing up?
If it's something that I feel is pertinent, so was in regards to an assignment, if it's in regards to something like a big project, or if it was a key point of discussion we had in the last class that a lot of students were really engaged in, and we just kind of want to either finalize it or put a bow on it and say we shall return to that at a later time. But if it's something that I feel like I have exhausted the last 2 or 3 class sessions and we're really kind of over this now, then it's like, we're not going to put a bow on this. Let's just put the dirt on it and just bury it deep, deep, deep within ourselves.
Do you tell them that, or do you just move on?
Usually for me, the best way of moving on is to move on and not mention it.
Yeah, no, likewise.
Because this generation, they're already forgotten things the minute they walk out that door.
Yes, this is true.
Anything we missed in the last episode, we talked about student expectations. Obviously, that's going to branch out into other sort of varieties as we go forward. But anything that you want to touch on about student expectation before we kind of move things along here?
You mean from the last podcast?
From the last podcast, yeah. And that seems like we did that weeks ago.
And we did, actually. And like the students you just mentioned, I don't remember the last thing I said in that podcast.
It's true.
Do you remember the last thing you said?
I do.
You do?
I think it was goodbye, farewell, Auf Wiedersehen.
Well, then how could we add to that?
I don't know.
All right. You know what? One thing we haven't done yet, we haven't told the listeners what we're doing this episode.
It's true. And we did in the last episode mention that we are talking about ethos, pathos, and logos. And for those of you who might be listening, you say, those are just philosophical terms. How am I going to use that in a math class, in a science class? First of all,
but they're Greek terms.
Yes.
And I'm Greek, so I feel thank you for a shout out.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
And since they are Greek terms, that means they are applicable to everyone. I mean, ethos in Greek means applicable to everyone. At least that's my rough translation of it. You might be able to say that better than I can.
Oh, in Greek, ethos.
Yeah.
And then pathos and logos.
And in pathos in Greek is be quiet and listen to what we have to tell you, right? Isn't that what the translation is?
I don't think I learned that in Greek school.
Okay, well,
be quiet and listen to what I have to tell you.
So if you were to describe to the listener what exactly each of these terms mean, what would you say? So starting with ethos or ethos. Is it ethos?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, we can say ethos. Either way, ethos, ethos, tomato. I think the simplest way to put this, though different people will lead perhaps with something different, I think of authority. In other words, the person, the people, the source, the article, wherever I'm getting this information from, are they a reliable authority? And if you think about this, so much of what we learn, so much of what we know is based on authority. Mm-hmm. In fact, the vast majority of knowledge comes from the fact that somebody told us. Simple example I give in the classroom, I said, how many of you here believe that eating fruits and vegetables are good for your health? And everyone raises their hand. I said, okay, me too, but none of us have done this lab work. We trust those who've earned the right to be heard, the scientists, the nutritionists, etc. Or the earth goes around the sun. We all agree. None of us have done that work ourselves. We trust the authorities who have told us. So the issue is it a reliable authority? Is it a credible source? Does the source care about us? Does the source have our best interest in mind? These are some other factors as well. I mean, it's not all of them have to be there all at once. Another one is sometimes the character, the virtue of the source. Are they honest? Are they reputable? It doesn't have to be that they're just famous or recognized by the nation, like, oh, Stephen Hawking has told us something from physics. Well, we listen to him because he's earned that right. He's an amazing physicist. Mm-hmm. So how about you? Have I left anything out? You probably can add something to that I've left out.
Well, and to piggyback off of all those things you just said, which were great, and it's a great explanation of what ethos essentially is. As an English instructor, we are asked to teach in regards to finding credible sources, building on those particular sources, making sure that your work is representative of the sources that you utilize. And one of the things that kind of touched on earlier was, well, how are these things applicable even if you are a math teacher or a science teacher? There is an element of ethos that each instructor has to provide to the classroom. And if you can't back that up on a regular basis, if you can't give the students a reason to believe that you are this sort of credible source, then they're not going to give you the time of day, or they're not going to take you as seriously, or they're not going to hold what you say with a certain amount of weight or gravity. And that's something that you can establish early on. That's something you have to consistently reinforce throughout the semester. And, we're not here telling you have to be this dictator or authoritarian figure, but there are many ways to establish a certain level of a credibility for your classes and for what you teach in those classes.
You're taking the idea of ethos, logos, pathos, and it's not, look, we teach these three methods of persuasion to our students, but you're saying us as teachers having it. This is what you've now applied directly to us as teachers, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, do you think, though, that there's ethos built in just from the fact that we walk in first day, we're in front of the classroom, so isn't there a built-in ethos already because they're expecting us to be somewhat, experts or authorities in our field?
And that is true, that they are going to an institution. Most of you who are probably listening to this, or the one person that is probably listening to this,
hi, Ma,
is probably has to do with some sort of college track, but there is the idea that if you're going into a classroom, that the person teaching it has some sort of authority, has some sort of knowledge or expertise in whatever it is they're teaching. However, that's true up until some instructors open their mouths. Or, the same thing can be said about a guy who's been hyped up to be this great boxer, and then all of a sudden that bell rings and you find out that it was all hype. So we have to build on our credibility each day. And I think that any person in any field has to build on that once they are involved in the actual class, if they're involved in the actual activity, that they have to prove their merit.
What do you think is one of the most common ways that we weaken our ethos in the classroom, that we, in their eyes, we might come off now as not credible? What is it? A student asks a question that we don't know the answer to? Is that the only way or the primary way?
I think first and foremost, absolutely. I think that's connected to it. I think with anything, when there is ethos involved, there is ultimately a level of trust that you have with that person. And one thing that you always want to maintain is that kind of trust. And one way that at least for me in my experience, how that trust is sort of diminished is when you refuse to answer questions or you are not honest with your students. And there are going to be times where we don't know the answer to every question. Despite what we might say or believe, we don't know the answer to each of those questions. So oftentimes in those situations, I find myself feeling that it's better to be honest and say, if I don't know that answer right now, but I will find out for you. Or if anyone here does know it, please enlighten us.
Have you done that in the classroom? Have you opened it up saying if anyone here does know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because there are topics that we discuss in class that I'm not 100% entirely sure of, because I like to have open discussion, open debate, open conversation. And there's people in class who might be more learned about a subject than I am, more knowledgeable. So I never want my students to feel like they don't have a place to express themselves or be open, especially when it comes to topics they know that they're passionate about.
Okay, fair enough. And me too. Like if someone brings up something about auto mechanics, I know virtually nothing about auto mechanics. I'm a philosophy and religion teacher. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't know all three, but I'm just saying myself, that's not my area of specialty. But now here's a question though. Have you ever done that in class where you opened it up to them because you said, I'm not sure, when it's a question in your area?
Yes, and to kind of give an example.
'Cause that's more humbling.
Sure. Sometimes, like for instance, just recently, there was a question a student had in regards to citation, and MLA, for those of you in the English department, tends to update itself regularly. They're on MLA 8 right now. And in regards to citing maybe a website or something a little more abstract or a video channel or something that's streamable, if I don't necessarily know specifically this is exactly what you need to cite, I am familiar with your typical MLA citations, but with all these new points of reference coming out, you're going to have different means of citation. And in that case, I said, I do not know the specific answer. Purdue OWL is the most up-to-date MLA reference point. I can reference it for you and get back to you, or here's a link to XYZ, and you can go find it yourself.
Nice.
And obviously you don't say that in a condescending way, unless you are really trying to make a point. But most of the time, you're really just trying to learn, just as anyone else is. Because as instructors, we're not the be-all, end-all authority points, and we're learners as well. So to me, if the core of Ethos is at trust and that credibility is breached, then to me it is lost.
And don't you think we build on our credibility and trust when we do show humility in the classroom by saying, you know what, I don't know that answer.
Yep.
And it's a great lesson. Like you said, even as teachers, we're lifelong learners. We should be lifelong learners. So to admit that, and it probably doesn't happen a lot, but when it does happen, to admit it and even make a joke about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And say, I know the image has been broken now that you think all your teachers know everything. I said, but no, everyone's finite. We're all learning. No one knows everything, even in their own particular field. And that's one of the exciting things about education. It never ends.
And what was funny is that, as you said, there is this image of students going into a class and seeing having an expectation for their instructor. And then when you see them outside of class, if you ever run into them, it's almost as if that Ethos screen has been broken. Like you are no longer that point of authority, that you are just this guy out there in the world. You're just like me. And then your kryptonite.
I know. I saw I was in third grade, saw my third grade math teacher after school having a cigarette in the parking lot, and it just was the end of the innocence for me. I'm like, wait a minute. Not only is she out of the classroom, because we all thought they lived there, right?
Sure, of course.
But now she's smoking a cigarette. Now in third grade, my parents told me never smoke cigarettes. It's like, do I trust my third grade math teacher anymore? But no, she was a good lady and good teacher.
And it's unfortunate that she picked up such a disgusting habit.
Oh boy, now you just alienated many of our listeners who
Why?
might be smoking cigarettes.
Oh, I was referring to teaching, not smoking.
Gotcha.
Okay, so moving on to, if we were to summarize with pathos and logos, what are we, because I know we had this discussion off mic about sometimes people get the confusion of logos and ethos.
Yes, yeah, because we think authority, credibility as far as ethos, but that's the credibility, the reliability of the source.
Of the source, the
whether
individual.
it's the company, the
Right.
individual, the article, whomever. Was that right? Whomever?
Yes.
Okay. You're an English professor, so I thought.
Or that ever.
That ever?
No, there's
Okay.
no such thing.
You know,
If there is, I'm trademarking.
quick little tangent here. You were mentioning credibility and being humble. You know when that comes up the most for me is when I'm writing on the board and I don't know how to spell a word.
Yeah, right.
I will turn to the class and say, guys, is this right? And sometimes it is right,
Mm-hmm.
or usually it's right, but it just looks weird to me. But it's not uncommon for me
Sure.
to have spelled it wrong,
Mm-hmm.
and they point it out, and we all have a good laugh about it. And then I make the joke that but there was no red line that appeared underneath
Right,
the word
exactly.
as I wrote on the dry erase board.
Or you just automatically turn the word into illegible cursive so that you can get past the part you don't know how to spell.
I
and
never even thought of that.
Oh,
That's
see,
a
there you
good
go.
strategy. See, we give you nuggets of wisdom here. What are we on now?
then,
Logos?
The variance between logos and
Okay, so we'll move from the reliability of the source to the reliability of the arguments or the evidence itself. I mean, logos, we think of the word logic that comes out of that. It means many things in Greek. It can mean reason, it can mean word, it can mean many things. But how good is the evidence? Is it rational? Is it factual? Does it make sense to the audience? This is where the proof is in the pudding, as they say, where it's in the actual evidence, the reasons, the examples given. Again, is it rational, reasonable? Does it make sense to the audience? And does it support the thesis?
Absolutely, and this is crucial, and this is applicable to all classes, because if you think about how logos works, it's essentially the structure of what it is you're trying to get across, and this is usually based off a premise or an initial idea. So if your premise says one thing, but then your argumentative structure focuses on something else or does not reinforce that, then the logos is all messed up. And so this is also applicable to other classes where if you start off the lesson saying you should know this by the end of class, or this is what I want you to get out of it, but the majority of the class you're talking about something else, then everything is all which way. And so you have to kind of reconfigure exactly how you want to approach that and how you can keep everything sort of uniform and everything in order logically, or at least in a way that makes sense not just to you, but mostly your students.
Yeah, that's a great point. In class, I consistently use the house metaphor. Of course, the roof being the conclusion or the thesis or our claim, and then the walls being the logos, right? The evidence, the support. And I'll say it over and over again when we evaluate different points of view on various topics. I'll say, okay, class, in this case, do the walls support the roof? Another way I say it is I'll point to the conclusion. I'll say, guys, can we get here? And I'll point to the reasons from here. This because of that. Does it work? And we evaluate that together.
And then lastly, moving to, I would say everybody's favorite in Pathos.
And I think this is the one that is most persuasive in our culture.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm not so sure if that's a good thing entirely.
No, and I would agree that ultimately you want to strike a balance between all three, but we have become a very emotion-based culture. We are driven by the things that we want to feel, by the things that make us emote in any particular way, and it's become clear that many places' agendas want to utilize different emotions to try to convince you of something or persuade you of something.
Yeah, advertising, right? A prime example of this, they reach our emotions, they go for our emotions, and oftentimes we have some wonderful advertisements or advertising agencies out there. I tell the class, when I don't feel like working out, I go on YouTube and I put on a Nike commercial or 2 or 3, and within minutes I'm out the door. Because those commercials do such a great job at motivating and making you feel like, yeah, let's go do this, as their slogan says. Of course, just do it. Where do you see pathos a lot in culture? What's an area where they are going for the heart and leading with the heart instead of perhaps the mind?
Well, it's easy to see that, as you said, in advertising, in politics,
Yes.
and even, news to this point, as we look at news as this sort of objective platform. But many news stations now, if you look at the rhetoric, if you look at the terminology, the sort of discourse that's utilized, it's very emotion-based. There's this lack of objectivity, and it's primarily more driven by breaking news or this just in. It's not an objective sort of approach because they want you to get glued in that something dramatic or something impactful has happened. And we'll get back to all this in a second. And speaking of advertisements, let's take a short commercial break for one of our favorite advertisers here on Classroom Hacks. And we'll get back to you after a quick word from our sponsors.
This Sunday, in a one-night-only extravaganza, Classroom Hacks presents the ultimate battle for academic supremacy and personal sanity as teachers take on students in awkward exchanges to retaliation. See Professor Smith take on the vagrant student in an epic email battle. Watch as composition instructor Jennifer Johnson takes on the plagiarizer. Witness a tag team spectacular as teacher and teacher assistant duke it out with the constantly arguing couple of the class. Behold, the student battle royale as one valiant lecturer tries to take on 20 different questions at once. And in our main event, for the academic championship of the world, the tired, weary, semester-worn educator clashes with the student who's been missing since the beginning of the semester and wants to talk about their grade. It all takes place this Sunday at anywhere there are students and teachers.
And we're back. So, Pedro, we were just talking about Pathos. We ended on that particular idea, and throughout the commercial, you were talking to me passionately about the usage of Pathos and sort of striking this balance. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I didn't want the listeners to think that pathos or emotion is not legit, because I said at the beginning of the pathos discussion how this I forgot how I said it, but this leads the way, and it's unfortunate that this is the main. There's nothing wrong with appealing to people's emotions. There's nothing wrong with moving people in our speech, our article, etc. In fact, we are emotional creatures as well, and that's a beautiful thing to reach our emotions. I think it becomes a fallacy or becomes illicit when we use emotion in place of a good argument or in place of evidence or reason. It should include both. If we can move people by our message and give them good reasons and evidence, that's a beautiful thing. Then we become Aristotle.
Yeah, and in our position, ultimately, one of our goals is to try to get students to connect to that balance of all three, because it's on the surface level, I would say that at that age, it's very easy to just let emotions kind of run things, that we are these emotional creatures, and especially in this day and age where we tend to cling to our emotions first and then we kind of put everything else aside. And as Pete brought up here, that if we were all masters of this, yeah, we would be Aristotle. We'd be Zen with all this stuff. But the reality is that we're not. And so one of the things we like to try to engage our students in is to try to find this balance with all of that. And as instructors, we should try to do the same thing as well, because it's easy for us as well to kind of get emotional, especially when we might feel that our pride has been hurt in some way, if we're challenged in a certain way and we don't feel like we know an answer. There have been times in my career where I've been challenged by students and I had to go into the think tank and really reflect on it and not let my emotion kind of surface throughout class, and just kind of take a step back, think about what was said, how it was said, and kind of evaluate from there.
Yeah, good point. And I think we can both identify, not just in the classroom, but how many decisions in life we've made just based on pure emotion. Usually doesn't go very well. If that's all we have, are strong emotions to make a decision. Another thing I tell the students is when we are moved, whether it's anger or happiness, we read an article, we see something on the news, and it moves us. I say, you know what, when we are feeling a strong emotion, stop for a second and examine that emotion. Say, what's underneath it? Is there a principle? Is there an idea? Is there some logos underneath it that does spur on the emotions? And sometimes when we examine it, we do find, or we can find, that there is some injustice we might see in a news story, or someone's being treated in a certain way, and we feel horrible, and we feel like we should do something. So, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea is examine the emotion, see if there's anything behind it, or what is behind it, and maybe that a principle can be abstracted from that, or a moral, or some other rational piece of evidence that is driving the emotion.
That is something that you can work on for a very long time. And one thing also I want to say, speaking to Pathos, and this is something we'll probably talk about in our next episode as well, in terms of evolution and longevity when it comes to teaching. We're right now we're talking about emotion, overly emoting or utilizing too much emotion. But is there ever been a point that you've gotten where you feel like your emotion was taken, where you had no more, you became indifferent towards teaching, or you saw some indifference in class and you wanted to speak to that? And is that a bad thing?
So you're asking, have I ever experienced where I'm in the classroom and I just feel indifferent, or I'm lacking emotion about, say, the day's lesson, or whatever?
Or just in general?
Yeah, but this is not a teaching thing. I think this is a human thing.
Mm-hmm.
You'll hear people who are wealthy and successful and famous, and they will struggle with apathy, or they will struggle with lack of feelings on certain days. And that's why I think emotions are a great companion. They can motivate us even, but they shouldn't be driving the car. I think back to Plato's illustration of how reason should be driving the chariot and guiding desire and emotions throughout our lives. So emotions are great and in and of themselves, but they should be guided by reason. So on those days where I don't, quote unquote, feel it, I don't go up based on my feelings. I go based on, okay, I'm in classroom today. Isn't part of the definition of being a pro giving your best when you don't feel like it?
Absolutely.
And so that's it. We step up. We realize there's 20, 30 other students here, and let's give them our best even when we don't feel like it. And sometimes, have you experienced this, where you start the lesson off, you start the discussion, what have you, and as it's going, the emotion follows.
Oh, absolutely. Part of me wants to elaborate on that now, but then a part of me also says, keep them wanting more. So if there's anything else you want to say about this topic, I think we can, but I think to kind of speak on that for our next episode, which will be coming up, which will be looking at evolution and longevity, the evolution of not just myself and Pedro in the next episode, where we came from, where we are now, but also how do you kind of maintain a longer shelf life as an instructor? Because as we just kind of talked about, there will be days where you might feel burnt out, but you ultimately don't want to get to that point where this is just a job, and then eventually to the point where you hate it or you don't want to show up, and then that eventually reflects onto your students. So how do we kind of avoid those pitfalls? But before we go, Pedro, is there anything else that you wanted to say or address to the audience?
One thing I don't think we did at the top of the episode was, I don't think we introduced ourselves.
Well, I did, but then you never.
I never said my name?
No, because we got into the Batman and Robin thing.
Oh, so you said Eric.
Yeah, I said I'm Eric Tan, and
I never said I'm Peter
right,
Panettis.
I jumped the gun on that one, and I should have given you the opportunity to say who you are. So go ahead.
It's okay.
We'll see you next time, folks.
You just did it again.
Hello again, everybody. We hope you enjoyed episode 3 of Classroom Hacks, Ethos, Pathos, and Logos. I just wanted to give a quick shout out to duringofficehours.com, a wonderful website for college educators and instructors who might be looking for some additional advice in regards to their classroom activities, assignments, lesson plans, handouts, syllabi, composition, creative writing, poetry, you name it. Duringofficehours.com has it. It's a great community of innovative and creative people all coming together, sharing their knowledge, their wisdom, their expertise about all these subjects. A new semester is upon us, so if you happen to have some advice for your fellow educators, duringofficehours.com is taking submissions, so feel free to contact them and potentially provide them with some Words of Wisdom. Go check them out today during officehours.com. Teach, share, learn.